be most remembered for, and I hope you'll be most remembered for, is your support for people on the backbenchers. And as you know, I'm a permanent backbencher, Mr. Speaker, so this is more important to me than anybody else. As I always say, the one thing that me and the Prime Minister always agree about is that I should be on the backbenchers. And you have always been a champion of people on the backbenchers, to allow everybody's opinion, whatever it is, to be heard in the chamber, and I've always been immensely grateful for that. I remember when I first entered Parliament in 2005, and some people have very short memories, but I remember on question time we've barely got beyond question 6 or 7 on the order paper. At Prime Minister's questions, if you were past question number 10, you had no chance of being called, to much irritation to many colleagues who had spent ages trying to get on the order paper for Prime Minister's questions, then found that they couldn't even get to ask the question. And now, I don't think anyone could possibly go back to that kind of regime. And I don't think any speaker would, the House wouldn't allow any speaker to go back to that regime. And it's because of you making sure that backbenchers got to have their say that has made what I think will be a permanent change to the way that this House operates. I've been very grateful for your friendship over many years, the fact that you came to my constituency and spoke at Beckfoot School, which they particularly cherished. I hope we'll stay in touch after you finish in your term, Mr. Speaker, and I wish you every success for the future.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman, and he and I will continue to have curry together. I think we can be sure about that. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity to put on record my thanks to you and my appreciation for all your guidance and support since the day that I was elected. Mr. Speaker, you are an extraordinary parliamentarian, human being and friend to so many, and I extend that also to your family, who deserve our thanks. Mr. Speaker, your welcome to new MPs, I know, goes a long way to settling them in this House at a very, very daunting time for them when everything is so confusing. I know for me, it went a long way to giving me the confidence to step up in this House and to do my duty on behalf of my constituents, and I thank you for that. May I also say a thank you to Mr. Speaker to you on behalf of my family. My brother Sandeep in Australia has just texted me to say that he also wants to extend his best wishes and his thanks to you, particularly for your support when we were going through extremely difficult times, notably the illness and death of my father. You were accommodating when I had to leave before debate ended. You came to our last family tea downstairs, and your letter to my father wishing him good health was a huge boost to his spirits in his final months. Mr. Speaker, your commitment to equality and well-being has been second to none in this House. And I know how much you have done. It has indeed been an honour to serve on your Speaker's committees on equality, diversion and inclusion since very soon after I was elected, and I am grateful to the opportunity for having done so. You've done incredible work, often behind the scenes, on achieving a proxy vote for colleagues that are benefiting from that now in this House. You've been committed to increasing diversity in senior and significant positions in this House. And the visibility of that diversity in senior positions has gone a long way to making this House feel more relevant and inclusive, not just to us here, but to those outside. It's a statement.
It's a strange
odd statement. I'm not sure whether I'm giving way or not, but I'll carry on now. Your work in the Education Centre as well has been extraordinary. You are an agent of change, and you set a standard for how to push the boundaries for reform and revitalisation, needed desperately, no matter what the organisation. So I want to thank you also on behalf of my constituents, because I know that hundreds, and if not thousands, have been through, particularly the education centre, young people, often at primary school age, who have been able to experience the house and to build a connection, which is a place that is their house and which is fighting for their future too. And I have no doubt that there are future parliamentarians and indeed future speakers who will be coming into their roles in public life as a result of their experience from our fantastic education centre and all those who work in it. You have opened up Speaker's House, where we have held events like Vaisakhi, Sikh Awareness and History Month, and indeed you hosted the first anniversary of a new project in Hounslow, Hounslows Promise, seeking to advance the education attainment, social mobility and employability of our young people. Mr. Speaker, I also pay tribute to you for your defence of this House and our democracy. This is a House that is a beacon of democracy across the world. Its integrity, its reputation as a national institution goes beyond us as individuals and must never be taken for granted. It is indeed for each of us to protect and safeguard this House, because it is our democracy that keeps our nations safe. And Mr. Speaker, you have led us through unbearable times, like the events that have stunned the nation, the terror attack on Parliament, and the murder of our dear friend Jo Cox. Seeing also through the unconventional but extremely important and peaceful unveiling on a Saturday of her coat of arms here behind us by her husband and her children. I was honoured to be here that day, along with local councillors, Councillor Adriana Georgia, Councillor Candice Atherton and Councillor Samia Chowdhury and others, who came to support the family at that time and to remember Jo. Mr. Speaker, in the Chamber, you have been tough and fair when needed, whether that's with the front bench or the back bench. But you have also been generous when needed, such as when there have been urgent constituency matters, including events like the life and then the death of young Charlie Gard from my constituency, or indeed on policy matters like the issues for young offenders in Feltham Young Offenders Institute. You have allowed us to raise those issues at moments of great importance, and I am grateful to you, as my constituents are, when that has made the difference. Mr. Speaker, you have touched the lives of hundreds of thousands who have walked through the doors of this place. You are loved by many across this House, political friend and foe alike, and you will be deeply missed. I know, however, that this will not be the end of a sterling career, and that whatever you do next will be a great contribution to our democracy and to our country. And I'm excited, as well as intrigued, as to what it might be.
Thank you. Mr. Richard Harrington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, you have been given careers advice today by people rather more experienced than me, particularly the member for Huddersfield. But I've been thinking a lot about this, and I would like to. I thought, Mr. Speaker, the obvious. At first, I thought, well, maybe you could be the next host of the Radio 4 programme, Just a Minute. But then, of course, can you imagine, with your experience, no deviation, hesitation, or repetition? No chance. But I then thought of a programme of my childhood, which older members here may know. Certainly, I think you may, and indeed the Leader of the House, and that is a remake of the programme Call My Bluff. Because I do think, Mr. Speaker, you could indeed be the Frank Muir character, for those that remember it. For the younger members of the House, the programme, something of which I do feel you should be very proud, because you have taken it to new bounds. sarcasm as a form of controlling 650 people and my children and indeed my former employees. But finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say fans everywhere. My mother has a large photograph of you on her mantelpiece at home. I'm continually compared, why can't you be like John Bercow? And also Miss Harriet Rainbow in my office, the doyen of the Watford Parliamentary Office, big fan as well. Mr. Speaker, every time I've stood up, I say thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to finish by saying thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable gentleman's extraordinarily generous. But the honourable gentleman, as well as being a very diligent member of Parliament, talks about his employees. He's employed a lot of people over the years, and his mum knows very well. Before he came into this House, he was an extremely successful business person, something I've never been. Lots of things I've never been, but I've never been a successful business person. But I want to thank the honourable gentleman for what he said and for the way in which he has said it. And Mr. Ian Mearns.
For the very last time, I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. It has been a real pleasure to work under your speakership for the last 9.5 years. And my honourable friend, the right honourable friend, the member for Cunnan Valley, to a certain extent stole a little piece of my thunder, and that was the fact that the BBC this morning were reporting that you would use the phrase order, order on no fewer than just under 14,000 times. Now, I'm just thinking, maybe you're fortunate in one way of having nearly achieved that 14,000 record, because you might not have achieved that had we been living through less interesting political times. And I think, you know, the interesting political times that we're living through were kind of exemplified 2 Saturdays ago, and we in this chamber, in here, assembled to say prayers, and your chaplain used the word "be not anxious," and a giggle, a nervous giggle ran around the house. And I just thought to me it was a sort of moment to treasure, but also a moment which captured the mood of this House and the mood of the country about the political position that we are currently in. Mr. Speaker, you've been a true champion of backbenchers for the entire duration of my tenure in this House, which is 9.5 years. And for 9 of those years, I've served as a member of the Backbench Business Committee, and for the last 4.5 years as chair of that committee. And, sir, you have been a champion not just of backbenchers, but of the role of the Backbench Business Committee, which came into being when I first entered this House. The Backbench Business Committee have, through your speakership, been allowed members across this House too far away from this very establishment. Mr. Speaker, it's been a pleasure to work under your speakership, and can I wish you a very long and happy next stage of your career.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Can I just ask your indulgence, because I have to go and chair a debate in Westminster Hall, and I just wanted to pay an initial tribute to the Speaker's chaplain, because Bishop Rose has been an inspiration to all of us. And one of the great joys of having an early question on the order paper is to come into prayers and hear the uplifting, spiritual and holy Christian way in which he conducts those prayers. Now, Mr. Speaker, when I came back into the House in 2001, after a short absence, courtesy of an ungrateful electorate, you and I became friends. In fact, we always happened to sit quite near each other. It was the third row back, quite near where the right honourable member for Huddersfield sits. And you always gave me good advice. I mean, I'd been in the House for a few years before that, but the House had changed a great deal. And at that stage, I think you were, at different times, Shadow Chief Secretary for Treasury and Shadow Secretary of State for DFID. And we had very interesting discussions. In fact, you were robust. You made me look like an old-fashioned Tory wet and a moderniser. But you also, Mr. Speaker, taught me something else, because you were, when you tried to catch the Speaker's eye, when you jumped up, you had a habit of, I won't demonstrate it now, but you had a habit of giving the back of the bench in front a very, very loud kick, a firm kick. And it always worked, because Speaker Martin would look up and he'd see you and he'd call you. And on one occasion, I was trying to get called, and you in fact, were sitting next to me, not trying to get called, and I started kicking the bench in front, and Speaker Martin then called you, even though you weren't standing. But, Mr. Speaker...
One of the few people he knew.
Well, that's certainly is not a fault with this Speaker, because his extraordinary memory and recollection of every single name and every single detail regarding every colleague is beyond extraordinary. But, Mr. Speaker, I've spent the last fortnight or so on the Speaker election at Hustings, and we haven't agreed on everything, but one thing we have agreed on, all 9 of us, is that you have done the most superb job for backbenchers. Through the UQ revolution, through backbench debates, and through calling colleagues when you know they have a particular constituency interest. We also agree that what you've done in terms of outreach for children and for schools has been transformational. I can testify to the fact that in the past, when school parties came down from Norfolk, they would meet me in Central Lobby, we would struggle to find a committee room, there was nowhere to go and have a cup of coffee. Now they can go to the Jubilee Cafe, they can go to the new education centre, and it is a completely different experience thanks to you, and you have made the lives of those children much more fulfilling in terms of our understanding of democracy than was ever the case before. And I just want to also make the point as well that and I do agree entirely with the Leader of the House, you look out for those colleagues who've got individual constituency cases where there might be a problem, there might be a real issue, and you come to the rescue of those colleagues and you help them get justice and some form of satisfaction for their constituents. And along with the Honourable Member for Gateshead, we were both on the HS2 Select Committee, and during that inquiry we spent a lot of time along the route of HS2, including a number of days in your constituency, Mr. Speaker. And we had a number of meetings with communities, with villages, with action groups, with residents. And one of the things that struck me, and I'm sure it also struck the Honourable Member for Gateshead, was whenever you arrived at a meeting of distraught residents, you not only knew the names of every single one of them in the village, you absolutely knew everything there was to know about that village, and you were a local MP on their side, admired and respected in a way that I think few of us could aspire to and achieve. And you were able to do that in spite of your duties here, in spite of being Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank you for the way in which you have helped me on a lot of different issues to do with my constituency and elsewise, both as a minister and indeed on the backbenches. And I just want to say finally that you can leave this place confident and secure that what you are leaving behind is a very powerful, special and long-lasting legacy.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for what he said. Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to carry on this theme about names, actually, because when I became selected, actually, as a candidate, my neighbour, John Prescott, seemed to have a problem with my name. He kept calling me Melanie. And when I got to the House of Commons, the Speaker seemed to have a problem with my name as well, because he referred to me as Jackie. So I was delighted, Mr. Speaker, that you have never had a problem with my name, and you've always called me Diana, which I'm very grateful. I just want to thank you. First of all, I want to thank you on behalf of the children of Hull, because through Hull Children's University, so many of them have been able to visit Parliament and to be able to use the Education Centre, which I know was very dear to your heart. And you will know Huddersfield's a long way from Westminster. Well, Hull's even further. So it's a great tribute, I think, to your commitment to making sure this place is accessible to children from all around the country. And also I want to thank you on behalf of the Youth Parliament and the work that you've done to support those budding politicians and to have them into this chamber and to oversee their proceedings as well. And I personally would just like to thank you for the kindness that you've shown me. When I've come to you with illness or adversity, you've always been a very decent, kind man, and I very much appreciate that. The other thing I wanted to say is that your use of urgent questions has been remarked on by many in the House today. And I think I probably have the record in terms of the number of urgent questions as a backbencher that you have granted. And that's been on the issue of contaminated blood. And I know that the community who've been infected and affected by that awful scandal in the NHS.
All good bookstores, there is a book called Be More Like Bercow. It is an excellent book.
Did he write it?
Mr. Speaker did not write it, but like one of the honourable ladies opposite, I have got him to sign a couple for options. It is a self-help book. It is a book with Mr. Speaker quotes that he has said over many, many years, and then on the page next to it, it then gives some self-help. So an example is, well, we've heard Mr. Speaker say on many times, calm down, man, a quote that I think will follow you around for some time. And then on the page next to it will be a mindfulness kind of lesson about how to breathe properly in order to calm yourself down. I think we can all learn from elements of the Be More Like Bercow book. One thing that is not in there, however, is how to not go to the toilet for over 9 hours. Mr. Speaker, you have the bladder of a camel. I feel that had you not announced your retirement, that we ought to think about reinstating the commode that is the Speaker's chair, or was once upon a time. I think that you're an extraordinary character, Mr. Speaker, and I've sat here since 9:30 this morning listening to some incredible tributes to you. I feel it's about time that I brought some balance into this, however, because it is true that you have been a champion of backbenchers. You are a champion of sport, and I, as Sports Minister, really appreciated that. And I still am very sorry for playing football here in the chamber. However, Mr. Speaker, you are still a gooner. It is true that, Mr. Speaker, I would like all Speaker candidates to promise me that the next Speaker will not allow for there to be another debate paying tribute to Arsene Wenger again, or indeed any other Arsenal managers, particularly if the Sports Minister who has to reply to it is a lifelong Tottenham fan, as I am. Mr. Speaker, I do not refer to those I employ as my staff. I think of them very much as part of my team. And in this place, we are nothing without those in our team. So may I take this opportunity not just to pay tribute to you, but also to thank Jim, Peter and Ian, who work for you, those that I don't know the names of, but I'm sure keep you in control. But also, can I thank Reverend Rose, who is very much part of our team here in Parliament. I have sought great comfort from her spiritual guidance. I forever will be grateful that she christened my son, Freddie. And so I'd like to thank her, and thank you, sir, and I wish you well in whatever happens next.
Thank you. Paula Sheriff.
Thank you. Oh dear. Mr. Speaker. It was all going so well. What can I say? And primarily, I hope we've moved on since that Wednesday, a few years ago, when you threatened me with an antisocial behaviour order here in this chamber. And I'll keep my remarks brief today, but like the Honourable Lady just alluded to, we are nothing without a good team. And I want to thank Jim, Peter and Ian, and of course Rose, and all of the others in your private office who have served you and all of us so well. They are simply the best of us, and just to demonstrate how their humanity is also so important, one of those gentlemen who I referred to when I was doing the period poverty work, the period poverty campaign, approached me one day in the corridor with a carrier bag, and he'd gone out and he'd bought loads of women's sanitary products, and he said, "Will you donate this to somebody in need?" He said, "I've never done that before. I've never gone into a supermarket or a chemist and bought these items," and I just thought that was really, really touching. Your humanity and your personal touch will never be forgotten, and there's been some very specific occasions when I think that has been really evident, and of course none other than when we lost Joe. The day after, you came to Birstall, which is obviously next door to my Dewsbury constituency, and you didn't just turn up and lay flowers. You stayed and you talked and you empathised with the local residents, and then you went on to the local church and you spent time again, and it was so appreciated, not just the gesture of actually being there, but your authenticity and actually, like I say, just spending time with local people who were feeling that loss so much. And equally after the dreadful terrorist incident here a couple of years ago, when we lost such a wonderful police officer, and it was such a traumatic time for so many of us, and you were typically stoic but equally very, very supportive as well. And indeed, in the last few months, when at times it's been a very difficult period for me, particularly with some of the abuse that I and particularly many other female members have received, and you actually called me at home one Sunday morning to ask if I was okay, because I'd received a particularly unpleasant, well, all death threats are unpleasant, but I'd received something that was particularly unkind, and I was very, very grateful for your support at that time. You're an extraordinary man, Mr. Speaker. I will miss you hugely. I wish you, your family, and I had the pleasure of chatting to them last week, and your delightful young daughter Jemima, who was an absolutely credit both to you and Sally. I wish you all every happiness. I look forward to reading your memoirs, and I particularly look forward to seeing you in sequins, potentially in a future episode of Strictly Come Dancing. Thank you, above all, for your kindness, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to apologise for not having been here at the beginning. I had to engage in a podcast with the Father of the House. It was a joint podcast. I say joint. He actually took up about 50, at least I think 90% of the whole podcast. So, to be fair, it was joint in the sense that it's joint whenever you sit and hear him and you ask him to speak briefly, and he does exactly that. So, first of all, I want to say a farewell to you, Mr. Speaker. We have known each other for a significant amount of time, I fancy. I want to say that you once referred to me, I think, as a sea green incorruptible. You may or may not remember that. I'm not quite sure to this day what you quite meant by that. But I think I had been rebelling against the government then for some time. And I think I fancy that you thought that was a good thing. And it was on the back of that when I became leader, I employed you, if you might recall, in the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Chief Secretary. It wasn't altogether a happy period, because I do remember being approached by one particular colleague of ours, who will remain completely nameless, who then upbraided me in one of the lobbies and said, it's fantastic that you've got somebody who is really campaigning on the rights for gay people and out there speaking on all these subjects, he said. And I was thinking, oh, well, very good, thank you. And he said, do you think we could have a Shadow Chief Secretary when you next get to the appointments in the Shadow Cabinet? I think he was not altogether enamoured of your journey, Mr. Speaker, but it was certainly a journey, and it is one that you have taken personal ownership of and have been part of the changes that have come about, and all those changes have been overdue, and I fancy, therefore, your legacy in this matter will also be something that is recorded by everybody, notwithstanding your period in the chair. And it's on that point that I really want to just deal very briefly with the idea of legacy. I remember the quote from Julius Caesar, which is, the evil that men does lives after them, but the good is often tarried with the bones. I want to reverse that process and just simply say that there is much that you have done in this House which is going to stand the test of time and will return it, I think, in a way, to where it probably was many, many decades before it became too subjected to the concept of the overarching power of the executive. I say that with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek because when I was unexpectedly in the cabinet for 6 years, I regularly used to curse you in the mornings at around about 9 o'clock when I heard that you had granted or about to grant a UQ. I think that came at 12, and I had to get some kind of reason why we should not have had that UQ to you, almost invariably told by your office that you had read it but not required that that was the case, and you granted the UQ. And of course, during that period, I don't think any minister would otherwise have not been frustrated, annoyed and angry. However, having returned to the backbenches, I have to congratulate you for reinvigorating the UQ from being an unusual event to being a very standard event. And I hope I have taken advantage of that. And it is true, of course, government doesn't like that. But when you're in government sometimes surrounded by all these decisions you have to make and things you have to do, coming back to the House, being forced to answer questions is a nuisance. But it is a nuisance that really does matter. And I think that matter alone, if nothing else, will be something which I remember now as a junior backbencher many times frustrated because I couldn't get in on a question and thought that I'd been pushed to one side and everybody else who was senior got in and the usual rules applied. And to that extent, any member coming in here now will not have any knowledge of how it was before. And they're just used to standing and getting called. But I often say to them, well, it was very different in the old days. You might stand for 3 separate questions, not related to each other, and still not get called. And then eventually you approach the chair, and the chair would say, well, next time we will call you. And you would then argue, well, I may not have an interest in the next question, but you would still have to come in and stand. Banishing that and getting rid of that process has been, and will stand as a very, very important legacy by you, Mr. Speaker, because it does allow non-privy councillors to get their word in. I have one word of slight advice that I generally take the rule that in this place, after about an hour, there is absolutely nothing that anybody is going to get up to and say that has not already been said at least 3 or 4 times. But you have been incredibly tolerant that even on the 5th time it is worth hearing and sometimes quite important. So on that, I think your use of this place, your reforms to this place were overdue. And I remind also, colleagues, that you came in at a very difficult time. This House was in shame. The expenses scandal was all that people in the country actually saw and thought of us in this place. They thought that all of us were corrupt, all of us were involved in it only for our own sakes, a fact which is completely untrue, as you know, that people come here because they genuinely believe that they want to do good and to try and improve the quality of life for their constituents and citizens around the country. But this was overarchingly now the form. We are still suffering to some degree from that. But I think the reforms were necessary to be done, such as opening this place up much more, letting younger people come into here, using the educational service and expanding that process, and giving, as I said earlier on, colleagues the power to bring governments into the dispatch box, to ask those questions, and to force them, even in difficult moments, to answer the most difficult questions of the day. That is, I think, a set of vital reforms that I cannot see any future speaker reversing, nor should they, because they are absolutely structural. We haven't always agreed, Mr. Speaker, on everything, nor should we, and there are times when, I confess, I've been somewhat frustrated, but as my honourable friend said earlier on, it isn't really about being frustrated about the decisions. It's whether somebody or not is consistent in the process that they engage in. And the one thing that you have been absolutely consistent in is your belief that backbenchers have the right and should have the power to be heard, regardless of whether you agree with them or you don't agree with them, whether sometimes they say things that might be an abhorrence to others. They have the right, because they were elected here, to be heard in this place without fear or favour. And in restoring that process, Mr. Speaker, I think that will be your greatest legacy. And therefore, in that, I wish you a very good, I suspect not retirement, but some other kind of career, maybe speaking across the States, where I gather you are becoming quite a celebrity on the speaking circuit. But whatever else you do, I know you will bring to it certainly not short speeches, but longer speeches, with words that nobody has ever understood or heard before. But notwithstanding that, they will be fascinated by it, as I have always been by your approach at the chair. So I wish you the very best of fortune, and I consider it, in a way, a privilege to have been in this House at the period when these reforms have taken place, and that you were the architect of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I get the opportunity again today for the second time. Thangam Debonair.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to say thank you to you on behalf of 3 groups of people. And one group is obviously, other members have mentioned, that the school children who've been through the Education Centre, thanks to you, and they've been inspired by that experience. I just want to echo that tribute that others have paid to you. But I want to add 2 other groups. One is my constituents. You have a lot of fans in Bristol West. If ever you feel like popping down, you will find a very warm welcome. And many of them have asked me to pass on to you their admiration, the fact that they've been glued to the television over the last year, which I do still think is really... It's an interesting byproduct of where we've been politically, that people are texting me saying, what's that funny thing you do when you bow at the table thing, they say. And, you know, that sort of interest has been facilitated by you. And then a slightly quirkier one is I want to say thank you on behalf of the very unofficial Parliamentary String Quartet, the Statutory Instruments. It was in your Speaker's Palace at a Christmas celebration last year that Emily Ben and I first hatched up the plot. We were enjoying the Christmas tree and I think probably some Christmas carols and possibly some mince pies at the time, so I will always be grateful to you for being there at the birth, perhaps, of the Parliamentary String Quartet and then at its first performance. And every time we play, we will be thinking of you. We're a little bit thwarted because we were supposed to be playing at a concert for the Archbishop of Canterbury on December the 12th. And I gather that we're going to be doing something else on that day. But the Statutory Instruments, we are grateful to you. And other people have said this, but I feel I have to add that you and Reverend Rose, and I can't be here for her tribute, you have been here for us at our darkest hours as well as our moments of joy and celebration. And those dark moments have been very dark indeed. June in 2016 in particular, and then as my friend, the Honourable Member for Dewsbury has referred to, the murder of PC Keith Palmer, and other times as well. You've been here for us. And it's been an incredible... it's a source of great support and comfort, both spiritual and non-spiritual, that the 2 of you have given to us as individuals. And then, as a whip, your views on whips are well known. And I think actually, despite what's been said about your views on whips, I've always known you to be actually really rather kind and helpful to us. And sitting here in Whip's Corner for 3 years now, I can't believe it's been 3 years, but I think the Chief will confirm that I have been an opposition whip now for 3 years. You have been extraordinary. I've learned such a lot from working by your side, and also, of course, from Peter, Ian and Jim, to whom I also owe a great debt of thanks, and I hope that they will not be leaving us, even if you are. I do think that the Leader of the House could perhaps have cleared up a mystery for us. He said that modernisation to him is an expletive. I think he said that. If that is so, I am slightly perplexed that he hasn't taken this opportunity to confirm that your 10 years of public service are being rewarded in the traditional manner. And I do think it would be courteous of somebody on the Treasury bench to clear that mystery up for us at some point in the not too distant future. And I think the traditional time to do that would be today. So he's shaking his head at me from a sedentary position. But I do think that somebody ought to clear that up. However, I know that whatever it is you go on to do, you will do so, I hope, billowed up on a cloud of love from us all, and admiration, and great enjoyment and collegiate spirit that you have shown to us, and I hope we have shown to you. And some of the greatest and the darkest moments in my 4 years here have been enhanced by your presence in the chair, including tiny little thing, which I think will best be left to my memoirs or yours, which involves a packet of peanuts and an order paper. Yes, you know of which I speak. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good luck.
Thank you. Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Time does not allow me to do justice to cover all the amazing work that you have done in the service of this Parliament. Before I came to this Parliament, I was a young barrister and I was told brevity is a virtue, not a vice, so keep it short. And you've applied that rule in this Parliament when we have all spoken. Mr. Speaker, there's three things which I want to cover. Accessibility, the way that you have treated backbench members of Parliament, and the issue of well-being. On the issue of accessibility, we all, members of Parliament, are amongst equals in this place. And you have applied that rule. And as a young member of Parliament many, many years ago, when you think you need to speak to the Speaker of Parliament, you contact the Speaker's office. I would like to speak to the Speaker of Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Chishti. And within minutes, the Speaker can be reached on his mobile phone in his constituency. Thank you to you and your brilliant team around you. I see one standing there and there's others. Of course, members of Parliament judge the moment when they need to speak to our Speaker. You are our Speaker. And the accessibility is a key thing for members of Parliament, for anyone, when they want to reach a person in responsibility. You, Mr. Speaker, have always done that. The second point is the champion of backbench members of Parliament. We all have our own cases. For me, Mr. Speaker, one thing which I can never compromise on, and I've done it throughout Parliament, is freedom of religion or belief. I came to this country as the son of an imam. My father was an imam, my grandfather was an imam, my uncles were imams. When I came to Gillingham in 1984, we could practice our religion openly and freely at every level. And morally and ethically, it would be wrong for me to stand up at any level when I see those individuals of minority faiths being persecuted. In 2014, Mr. Speaker, I wrote to you to ask for an adjournment debate in relation to the abuse of blasphemy laws in Pakistan, which are being targeted against minority faiths, and the case of Asha Bibi, who was on death row, before it came up in the media in the last year. I wrote to you, and you, Mr. Speaker, you gave me the chance to raise that on the floor of this House. Not just then, Mr. Speaker, but then knowing what matters to members of Parliament. We all have different issues that we champion. You, Mr. Speaker, you have been absolutely brilliant to realise and see the issues that matter to members of Parliament. So then when I resigned from government in November 2018, the government did not agree with my view on Asha Bibi case. I stepped aside. But then I wanted to question the Prime Minister at PMQs. I was not on the order paper. I was sitting right there. I'm slightly short, but I still bobbing up. And you, Mr. Speaker, called me so I could raise my issue with the person who had to make the final decision in that matter. So to you, for being a champion of members of Parliament on the backbench, you have been absolutely amazing. The third point I want to cover is this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's some outside who do not see members of Parliament or those who work here as fellow human beings. We are all human beings, and we all suffer from the challenges which every other citizen in our great country have challenges and issues that arise. And I want to touch on the work that you, Mr. Speaker, have done on the well-being of members of Parliament and those who work in this great Parliament. Mr. Speaker, there's three things I want to put on record. The way that you've dealt with those issues with compassion, with decency, and complete regard to human dignity, I cannot thank you enough for the way you have dealt with that. And you put in place a system with a brilliant Dr. Madden. It's a clinician-led approach. And I thank her because often those who do that work behind the scenes do not get given that credit. They do an amazing job. And Mr. Speaker, if individuals applied your approach of making sure that individuals, those who work here at whatever level, get the support when they need it, quickly, swiftly, appropriately, individuals can go on and be better than before. But that comes down to individuals in responsibility taking those decisions. And I end with this, Mr. Speaker. I was very fortunate to represent the Prime Minister in the Holy See at the canonisation of Cardinal Newman. I did not know much about Cardinal Newman, but when I was there, I listened to that great man's values. One of the hymns was Lead Kindly Light. I cannot see the distant scene. A step at a time is enough for me. You, Mr. Speaker, in the 10 years that you've sat there, Every step that you've taken, it has been for the betterment of this Parliament. To you, sir, thank you.
Thank you. Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened very carefully to the opening statement by the Leader of the House. I was interested to hear what he had to say. He's somebody I always listen very carefully to. He chooses his words very carefully, and he gives me the impression, at least, that he understands the meaning of them. After all, he's the only person I know who reads the lounge suit inside his jacket and takes it as instructions for use. But you, Mr. Speaker, have been someone who has challenged the rights of backbenchers, and I think there are people in this House who at times have benefited from that, who perhaps now time has moved on, don't quite appreciate the way that you've stood up for the rights of this House and for those of us who have wanted to stand up for our constituents. And the people I want to particularly pay tribute to you for standing up for are the people of the 48% who voted in 2016 to remain in the European Union. Because if we had listened to the government's views on the outcome of the referendum, which we all respect, you would have believed that it was a resounding victory and the country wasn't split at that time in 2016. But indeed the country was split, and it was for this House to stand up and hold the government to account and speak up for the views of those people who wanted to remain part of the European Union, but in leaving wanted to retain as much of our relationship with the European Union as we could. And without you, Mr. Speaker, having the strength of character to stand up to an executive that was prepared to try and run roughshod over those of us that wanted to hold the government to account, I think we would be in a very different place now, and that's a tribute to you. And I think that has earned you a place in history for these very trying times, and it's one that you deserve enormous credit for, in my opinion, and it's one that I will always admire you for, because at times it was very difficult for you. You were out there as an individual having to stand up to those people, and no doubt you've got an excellent team around you, but you did it for us, and for that I'll always be grateful. I also like to be grateful to your team. I went in, I don't do it very often, but I went in to plea with them that I could get called at Prime Minister's questions to raise something on behalf of a disabled constituent who had had their PIP taken away and were about to have their car repossessed on the Thursday after Prime Minister's questions. I didn't think I was going to get called, but because you have been generous with the time at Prime Minister's questions, you allowed it to overrun right at the tail end, and I always seem to get called at the tail end, but nonetheless, if you're patient, you get there, and you called me right at the end. And I can say to you, Mr. Speaker, and I thanked you when I was interviewed on the radio subsequently about this issue, as a consequence of me being able to raise that at Prime Minister's questions because you heard my plea and called me, that the lives of my constituents were completely transformed in a moment. And that's the power of being in that chair. And I pay tribute to you for the way you've stood up for us backbenchers so that we can stand up for our constituents. My constituents' PIP was reinstated and they didn't have their car repossessed. Your inspired appointment of Rose Hudson-Wilkin is, I think, is a testament again to your strength of character, your determination to modernise and take us forward as a House of Commons representing all of the people. And I pay tribute to Rose. I think she's got an amazing career ahead of her and will be a very influential person in our society going forwards in whatever role she goes on to when she ceases to be chaplain to the Speaker of the House. But my last point, Mr. Speaker, you came in 1997 when I did. You've got a constituency in the home counties. I've got one in London, so no doubt you had schools frequently visiting this place, taking them round on tours. And then on those rainy days when they wanted to have their packed lunch being told that the Speaker of the House and the Sergeant-at-Arms don't allow packed lunches to be eaten in the Westminster Hall. Yeah. And we didn't even have a cafeteria down there, and when we got the cafeteria it wasn't accessible to school children because you had to be buying something if you were in there. And it was an appalling place for young people to visit in terms of how they were welcomed. They were awestruck by the place and being taken round, and no doubt educated by all their MPs that were boring them to tears with the details of the House. But nonetheless, it was important that they were here. They were inspired by it, but then the House was very unwelcoming to them. The changes that you have brought about in opening up the education unit to this place, opening this place up to make young people welcoming, and make it a welcoming place for young people, I think has been inspired. I want to see more people, the Speaker that follows you, to do more of that. Yeah. And, but it is a mark of the way that you've brought modernisation and change to this House. You've earned your place in the history of this House, and I wish you all the best for your future.
Yeah. Bless you, Clive. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Henry Rosendale.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to pay tribute to you today. I've known you for the best part of 30 years. And I'd like to echo everything that's been said in the Chamber today, but I'm not going to repeat some of those tributes. I'd like to add to the tributes by saying things that haven't been said. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your patriotism, for being an upholder of tradition, and for being a lover of your country. You are a patriot. The Mother of the House said you were politically correct. Well, on these issues, you have never been politically correct. It was you, sir, who supported the long-running campaign to ensure the flag of our country was flown from the Victoria Tower every single day of the year. The House will recall that it was only flown when the House is sitting, and in the early part of 2010, the House agreed, with Mr. Speaker's support, statement was made in the House, the flag would fly every day of the year, 365 days of the year permanently. And that is, I think, a subject of pride in our country and is appreciated by many. It is also Mr. Speaker who has upheld the tradition of St. George's Day for England. When we celebrate our traditions for England, Speaker's House has been opened to the Royal Society of St. George and for organisations that have celebrated our English heritage. And I thank you, sir, for allowing the St. George's Day organisations to come to Speaker's House and celebrate the 23rd of April. But I also remember that it was this Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you, sir, who allowed the tradition, the sad tradition, I have to say, of crests of MPs that have been assassinated and murdered to be displayed in this chamber. For a very long time, the crest of Eri Neve was there, but the previous Speaker was not in favour of additional crests. And if the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you recall that Lord Howe of Aberfan and myself came to see you and asked if we could have a crest in favour in memory of the late Ian Gow, who had been murdered. And you were very supportive of that and led to not only a crest for the late Ian Gow, but also Dr. Robert Bradford, also the others that, of course, Joe Cox, and the others that were killed by Irish terrorists, Sir Anthony Berry, of course. So it is you, Mr. Speaker, that have allowed that tradition to be reinstated, so we can remember members of Parliament who are so cruelly taken from us by assassination and political murder. And also, the Diamond Jubilee of Her Majesty the Queen was a great celebration in the whole of Parliament, but it was Mr. Speaker who opened Speaker's House for a wonderful celebration of representatives of all of Her Majesty's realms and territories who came to London for that wonderful celebration. And indeed, how can we forget the renaming of the clock tower to the Elizabeth Tower? So there are many things that, Mr. Speaker, you will be remembered for and thanked for, but most of all, from my own personal point of view, for your kindness, your friendship, your understanding, your willingness to deal with issues when they arose, and to be on the side of backbenchers who also need a voice, and you've made sure we've had that voice. Mr. Speaker, you have been a wonderful champion of this House. You have promoted the Mother of Parliaments, and I believe that you will be remembered for many years to come.
Dr. David Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just start by saying what an honour it is to sit next to my honourable friend, right honourable friend, who will be sadly missed, and I completely associate myself with remarks for the Honourable Gentleman for the New Forest East. Now, I want to say something rather different. I want to take you back to a trip we made together to the Sudan. And I know you agreed to go at quite short notice. And we needed a Conservative member, and you agreed to come on that trip. And when people say, and I've never been to the Sudan, and this was pre-secession, without getting unwell, when you say that someone looks green, usually it's a great exaggeration. But I can assure you, on that trip when we flew around, on one occasion I looked at you and you were green. You were absolutely unwell. But you carried on, and we got to Nyala, which was at that time one of the hearts of the struggle for Darfur. As we got there, all the lights went out, but it was wonderful because they said, don't worry, we're going to go away to the local takeaway and we'll get you something to eat. I remember all day we hadn't had anything to eat, probably we didn't want anything to eat. Now, I was eternally grateful for what they brought back. I'm a vegetarian and I couldn't eat what they brought back, but you, because you were there, as always, and you ate. And the great tribute that they gave to us was that we were going to share the President's bedroom. And you and I went to the President's bedroom, and that was fine. But we were then able to take advantage of using the President's toilet. Now, whether it was a tradition of the Sudanese or not, but the President's toilet had previously been used. And I now know why you were going to be such a steadfast speaker, able to sit in that chair for 9 hours. Because you and I decided that it was one ask too many to use the President's toilet. And I now know why you're able to sit there for 9 hours, because the constitution of this speaker in this House has been built, dare I say, in that President's palace in Nyala. But you've been a friend. I know going round, and people don't realise that making those trips, it is our role and responsibility to go out and to visit the troubled spots of the world. And you did that, and I know you've done it, and hopefully you will do it in the future, because you will be welcome, you will be admired, and they will see you, not necessarily as the former Speaker. In the States, where they always refer to people as congressmen and senators, even though they may not any longer be in office. But it's been an honour to call you a friend, and as I say, that trip we made will always stand in my memory. I've been a number of times since, as you know, but we do say thank you to you, and long may your life continue, and hopefully toilets will be slightly better than one we were asked to use on that occasion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bless you, I've never forgotten that trip, and I never will do so, for all sorts of reasons. Bob Seeley.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I thought I'd missed the tributes to you, sir, because I thought they'd been. I'm delighted that I haven't. I was actually here today to follow your advice. Oh, and by the way, it's a great pleasure to follow the honourable member for Stroud. I fear I lack your constitution, because actually I've been dying for the loo, but I also wanted to get in, so I'm holding it in for the moment. I'm following your advice to persist, Mr. Speaker, because I was actually here to try to follow up. To get an answer from the Leader of the House, if he wanted to give one, on whether the government would allow debate in future on Huawei and the importance of 5G. But I'm very happy to ignore that if you feel that wouldn't be inappropriate.
No, I said to the honourable gentleman he could raise what he wanted to raise with the Leader.
That is very kind of you, sir, because I fear I might have not for the first time misread the order paper. However, it will make you happy to know that since Erskine May has been available online, I have been using it and taking it to my bed every night and reading it. And indeed, I was going to raise a point of order to ask Mr. Speaker, why paragraph 12 in chapter 20 consisted not of one paragraph but two, but the whips advised me against it. I think it was on the Saturday sitting, and we were all very keen to get away. Your support for backbenchers is always important and is incredibly welcome. And your calling ministers to account is excellent as well.
Of concern, and one the government takes very seriously. And the security and resilience of the UK's telecom networks is of the greatest importance. I obviously can't promise debates at the moment because we will have the dissolution on Wednesday, but the general election is coming up, and I have a feeling this is a matter that will be of interest to many people to ensure that we have a safe and secure system. The government has not as yet made a decision, and that is an important point to underline. In spite of press reports to the contrary, a decision will be made in due course, and I think a wide debate amongst the British public is the best thing that we can have. We should always trust the people.
Martin Whitfield.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. I don't intend to speak for too long because there have been some wonderful compliments made, and it's sometimes hard to sit and listen to people complimenting you, and that's a very human thing to do. So I would just like to say thank you from the first handshake when I took my oath and your words, to your lovely note after my first speech, to the tea morning with the new entrance with Rose and yourself in your chambers, and for the huge help that you have given and your staff have given with regards to Grace's sign and the Any Disability sign, but also to the JP McIntosh lecture that took place in the Speaker's House, which was gratefully received by his family and the people of East Lothian. For all of that and so much more, can I just say thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the honourable gentleman. Tom Tugendhat.
Mr. Speaker, I can see you're saving the best till last. It's,
That's what I was thinking.
it's a huge pleasure to speak and say thank you this afternoon, forgive me. I wonder, though, whether when we bump into each other again in years to come, I will feel as I did that time I jumped off my bicycle and a man 6 feet taller than I looked at me and said, "Hello, sir. I noticed you haven't polished your shoes today." He was the Academy Sergeant Major from Sandhurst, and I was wearing trainers. He was pointing out what he knew then, which is standards matter, and you have defended the standards in this House religiously. And for that, I can only be extremely grateful, because defending the rights of parliamentarians isn't actually about defending 650 people who may or may not have an opinion on a subject. It's defending the very principle of democracy in our country. It's defending the very principle of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and indeed individual liberty. And it is absolutely defending the foundations of the economy and the society that we have built with much care, many failures, but over many, many decades. And so for that, I am hugely grateful. And on a personal basis, if I may, there is one thing that I would like to thank you as well. You have not only introduced us to a wonderful chaplain who is here and to whom I pay huge personal thanks and tribute, but actually you've introduced a new chaplain in Father Pat Brown. And to have a Catholic chaplain in this House, to have a regular Mass on a Wednesday afternoon, is an act of extreme kindness to many of us in the Catholic community here in this place, but also reflects the fact that this House doesn't now legislate for the exclusion of one religion, does not now silence one form of worship, does not now reject the individual practice of so many people in these islands. And now I know you have been on a journey, and some people have spoken of your origins in one wing of the party and your arrival at the seat in which you now find yourself, and the defender of many liberties that would have surprised others 20 or 30 years ago. And many of us have been on a journey. I see the leader of the House sitting there, who, when I used to sit next to him, was a guardian of the purity of this House, and has gone from the purity of the Vestal Virgin to the whore of Babylon, deep in the executive power, with the speed of an extraordinary, of a whippet. But he is there, and we've all been on various different journeys. So I'm delighted that your journey has taken you to where you are now, and I'm personally grateful that the last 4 years, and particularly the 2 that I've had the privilege to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee, have been under your speakership, as you've enabled those of us who are very new to this place to have a voice, and I hope to represent some of the views that need speaking up for in our House, even if maybe sometimes we may chunter when criticised, almost certainly justifiably, but sometimes that may give us the cause to remember that actually your defence means sometimes we are in the wrong too. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I, on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for all that you've done as Speaker. And can also pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for Colne Valley. She sits behind me in this row regularly, and usually in her colour of red, very often. I said to her this morning before we came into the chamber, very often the Honourable Lady was the conscience for many in this chamber when it comes to human rights issues. And I know that when she spoke on human rights issues in this chamber, I was more than pleased to join with her on those opportunities to speak out and speak up for those across the world who don't have a voice, and who we in this House are very privileged to have a voice and be the voice for them. As a new member, Mr. Speaker, when I came in here in 2010, I said to you earlier on, I was just a tad nervous and maybe a wee bit apprehensive. I never ever thought, Mr. Speaker, that I would be in the House of Commons. It was perhaps maybe a dream, but something that never really happened in my life, and it did. And when I came in here, I remember vividly, Mr. Speaker, meeting you, and when you shook my hand, and you did it with a welcoming and a very generous introduction. And at once, Mr. Speaker, I felt the warmth that you exuded then and you exude now, and that put me at ease in this House. It didn't put me at ease with my maiden speech, because I was nervous as can be about that. But once you got that speech over, you realised that you could do it. As I learned the rules and the regulations of the House under your guidance, occasionally chastising myself, always rightfully and always justly, and I know that. And as I learned that the word "you" can only be used, but not for you, your good self, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm not quite sure if I've learnt that yet, but I know I'm trying hard to learn it, and I will endeavour to do so over the next period of time. As the backbench champion that you are, we in this House, and I felt that our views would always have an opportunity, and the voice of Strangford, to quote you, Mr. Speaker, that Strangford must and will be heard, and it was in this House, and we thank you for that. Your choice of Speaker's chaplain, which we'll have a chance in a few moments to refer to, and I wish to do that as well, was right and appropriate. Your choice of the Sergeant of Arms was also appropriate, and I support both of those. And for all your team support for Peter, for Ian, for Jim as well, always kind, always courteous, and undoubtedly a great team. Behind every great man, Mr. Speaker, and I believe, Mr. Speaker, you are a great man, is a great woman. And you've been very blessed and very privileged to have at your side as your wife, Sally, and her support for you was and is vital. And thank you to Sally and to the children for the support they give you. Because I know myself, Mr. Speaker, how important it is to have a family behind you to give you that support and that you need. The future, I believe, Mr. Speaker, for you will be successful. It'll be incredible. I'm a great believer, as you know, Mr. Speaker, in the power of prayer. I always have, and your chaplain will know that as well. And I believe that with prayer you can move mountains. And you know that every morning I pray for you, Mr. Speaker, and that will continue to do that in the times that when you're not in this chair and you've moved on to other jobs. You will not be forgotten, certainly not by me in this House, Mr. Speaker. I want to say as well, I will miss you in this House, Mr. Speaker. I'll miss you not least of all for the adjournment debates.